Imagine moving into your dream home, a beautiful, spacious colonial house. At such a good price, it seems unbelievable. But what if that dream quickly turned into a nightmare? Today, we'll share the true story of the Lutz family, who moved into a house in Amityville, New York, unaware that a horrific crime had occurred there the previous year. A series of terrifying events, supernatural phenomena, and the growing despair of a family on the brink of destruction. Get ready to uncover the dark secrets of the Amityville House and the evil that never truly left. It was a sunny morning when George and Kathy Lutz arrived with their 3 children at their new home in Amityville. The street seemed peaceful and the residential neighborhood welcoming. The house, with its Dutch colonial architecture and iconic eye-shaped windows in the attic, was set on a spacious lot, surrounded by a weathered wooden fence. Despite its imposing size and the unbelievably low price they paid, there was something about it that sent chills down Kathy's spine, an unsettling feeling she tried to shake off. This is a new beginning for us, Kathy thought, trying to convince herself. Life with George had been full of ups and downs, but the move promised stability. The house seemed perfect for raising their children, away from the chaos of the city. However, there was a shadow looming over the property. She knew, like many in town, that something terrible had happened there. About a year earlier, Ronald DeFeo Jr. had brutally murdered his entire family while they slept. Every detail of the crime seemed alive in the walls, but George insisted that the past shouldn't influence their future. "People need to leave the past behind, Kathy," he said firmly as he climbed down from the moving truck. As they unloaded furniture and boxes, the children ran through the house, exploring each room with curiosity. Chris, the oldest, seemed fascinated by the attic. Kathy, on the other hand, felt a deep discomfort. The energy in the house was heavy, as if each wall whispered stories she preferred not to hear. The first night was quiet, or at least it seemed so. Everyone was exhausted from the move. George, always a man of routine, turned off the lights precisely at 10 p.m. and settled down beside Kathy. The silence of the house was oppressive, but the two were so tired that they fell asleep quickly. However, it wasn't long before Kathy began to feel uneasy. She woke from a restless sleep in the middle of the night, sensing that something was watching her. The room was cold, even with the windows closed, and the darkness felt alive. Trying not to disturb George, she curled under the covers, repeating to herself that it was just the stress of the move. The next day, while unpacking boxes, Kathy noticed something strange on the kitchen walls. There were dark, damp stains, as if something was leaking from inside the house. When she called George to check, he simply laughed. "It's an old house, Kathy. Probably just leaky pipes. I'll take care of it." He always had a rational explanation, which temporarily reassured Kathy, but the discomfort only grew. On the third night, things became even stranger. George started waking up at the same time every night, 3:15 a.m. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, but after 3 consecutive nights, it began to bother him. He would go down to the kitchen for a glass of water, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. Sometimes he felt as if a figure was darting out of the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing there. Meanwhile, the children also began to behave unusually. Chris, the oldest, talked about a new friend he had met in the attic. Kathy and George dismissed it, thinking it was just a child's vivid imagination. However, Melissa, their middle child, began to complain about recurring nightmares of a dark figure watching her while she slept. Despite these small signs, George remained optimistic. He refused to believe anything was wrong with the house. "It's all part of the adjustment, Kath. Give it time for everyone to settle in," he said confidently. Kathy, on the other hand, felt that the house was testing them. There was an ancient, malevolent energy in the air, something she couldn't explain. By the end of that week, as George descended the stairs for another sleepless night, he looked out the kitchen window and froze. Outside, among the dimly lit trees, 2 red points glowed in the darkness, like eyes watching him. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and the points disappeared. George returned to bed in silence, not mentioning what he had seen. But deep down, something was beginning to disturb him. The house seemed to have a life of its own, a presence that felt more palpable with each passing day. The following nights became increasingly disturbing. George continued waking up promptly at 3:15 a.m., always with the feeling that something was watching him. Waking at that exact time began to mess with his head. It was as if the house dictated his sleep pattern. And, as before, he always found those red eyes in the darkness outside. After a few nights, he started to avoid looking out the window, fearing what he might see. The morning after yet another restless night, Kathy noticed George seemed different. He looked paler, with deep circles under his eyes and a distant expression. "Are you okay?" she asked, concerned. George merely shook his head, saying he hadn't been sleeping well. "It's just the stress of the move," he insisted, but deep down he felt something more sinister. While George struggled to ignore the growing discomfort, Kathy began noticing other disturbing details around the house. The stains on the kitchen walls had spread, despite George's attempts to clean them. And it wasn't just in the kitchen. Similar stains appeared in other rooms, as if the house was being slowly invaded by an invisible and corrosive presence. One afternoon, while organizing the attic, Kathy heard footsteps behind her. At first, she thought one of the children was nearby, but when she turned, there was no one there. The silence was so heavy that she felt the air compress around her. She quickly descended the stairs, her heart racing, deciding not to return to the attic alone. The children also began exhibiting unsettling behaviors. Chris insisted on talking about his attic friend, whom he called Jody. When Kathy asked who Jody was, Chris described a figure, big as a pig with red eyes. Kathy tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just a childish fantasy. But the description reminded her of something she was trying to forget. The red eyes George had mentioned seeing outside. The situation grew even tenser when Melissa, the middle child, began crying every night, claiming that someone was watching her while she slept. "He stands in the corner of my room, Mommy," she would say, her voice trembling. Kathy forced herself not to show fear, trying to calm her. But every time she left the room, the feeling of being watched followed her down the hallway. That night, Kathy attempted to talk to George about the children and their strange behavior. "It's just their imagination," he replied, trying to sound unconcerned. "They're kids. They always have imaginary friends." However, Kathy knew there was more. Melissa's nightmares were too intense, and Chris's descriptions of Jody were disturbingly consistent. While they talked, a loud crash echoed through the house. It seemed to come from the basement. They both froze for a moment before George stood up to investigate. As he descended the stairs, he felt the air grow thicker, as if he were entering another realm. When he reached the basement, the door was open, even though he was sure he had locked it earlier that day. Inside, nothing seemed out of place, but the chill in the air was palpable, almost suffocating. George returned to the living room without saying a word, but Kathy noticed the discomfort on his face. Something was definitely wrong with the house, and they both knew it, even if they avoided admitting it. The next morning, the phone rang unexpectedly. It was the priest who had blessed the house when they moved in. He sounded agitated, asking if they were all okay. Kathy, surprised by the call, said they were fine, despite everything. The priest hesitated for a moment before saying, "There's something in the house, Kathy. Something evil. You need to get out." Kathy was silent for a moment, the priest's words echoing in her mind. "I knew it," she thought, her heart racing. She thanked him for the call, but didn't have the courage to tell George. The reality they faced was too terrifying, and she didn't know if she could convince him. That night, terror seemed to have settled permanently in the house. George again woke up at 3:15 a.m. He went down to the kitchen, trying to ignore the growing sense of despair consuming him. But this time, there were not just red eyes waiting for him. Something was inside the house. In the days that followed, George began to change alarmingly. He, who had always been a practical and dedicated man, became more introspective, distant, and at times aggressive. The house seemed to exert a dark influence over him. His sleepless nights, always interrupted at 3:15 a.m., began to affect his mental health. The look he directed at his family was cold, as if he were observing strangers instead of his own wife and children. Kathy noticed everything, but hesitated to confront him directly. George's change in behavior terrified her, as much as the inexplicable events surrounding the house. He spent hours in the basement, a place that had always been dark, but now seemed to be calling to him. George claimed the basement needed repairs, but Kathy knew it was more than that. He was obsessed with that space, and each time he returned, he seemed more distant, as if part of him remained down there. George's detachment affected his relationship with the children. He, who used to play and spend time with them, now barely spoke or looked them in the eye. What was once a home full of laughter had turned into a place of suffocating silence, where each family member tried to cope with their fear in their own way. Kathy worried about the kids, especially Chris, who continued to talk about his friend Jody and Melissa, whose nightmares were becoming more intense. One night, after yet another silent and tense dinner, George, without saying a word, went down to the basement. Kathy tried to distract him, suggesting they watch a movie together, but he completely ignored her. Alone in the living room, she looked at the children, visibly shaken by their father's coldness, and felt a chill run down her spine. The next morning, Kathy woke up startled. George was not beside her. She quickly got up and, as she descended the stairs, found him in the middle of the living room, standing in front of the window, staring into the dark yard. "George!" she called softly, but he didn't respond. He remained still, like a statue. Kathy approached slowly, fearful of what might happen. When she finally touched his arm, he turned abruptly, his eyes fixed on hers with a disturbing intensity. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a hoarse voice, as if returning from a trance. I called you, you didn't answer," Kathy said, her heart racing. George stared at her for a few more seconds, then abruptly turned away and went upstairs, leaving her alone and still trembling. In the following days, George's behavior only worsened. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was always brusquely, as if he were on the verge of an angry outburst. The children began to avoid their father, afraid of his unpredictability. George, once so affectionate, now seemed a stranger to everyone. The tension in the house became unbearable, and Kathy began to fear for their lives. One afternoon, Kathy found something that took her breath away. While cleaning George's room and organizing his clothes, she discovered the journal of Ronald DeFeo Jr., the murderer who had killed his family in the house. The discovery made her tremble, and she quickly sat on the bed to flip through the journal. The entries were disturbing, filled with disjointed phrases, but one thing was clear. DeFeo spoke of voices that urged him to do the unthinkable. "I know what I have to do," one phrase repeated. "They are watching me. They want me to do it." Kathy felt her stomach churn. It sounded exactly like what George was experiencing. The sleepless nights, the strange behavior, the obsession with the basement, Could it be that the house was influencing George in the same way it had influenced DeFeo? She tried to talk to George that night, but he was more irritable than ever. "Why are you always watching me?" he shouted, throwing a glass against the wall, which shattered with a sharp sound. The children watched in silence, frozen with fear. Kathy didn't know what to say. She had never seen her husband so out of control. In the following days, the situation only deteriorated. George spent even more time in the basement, almost as if being sucked into the darkness of that place. He would emerge sweaty with a glazed look, as if he had just returned from a mental battle. When Kathy tried to ask what he was doing down there, he replied in a distant voice, "The house understands me. Down here, everything makes sense." Kathy could no longer hide her fear. The house was destroying her family, and worse still, it was turning George into something she barely recognized. The man she loved seemed to be disappearing, consumed by forces she couldn't explain, growing more isolated. She feared that at any moment he might become as dangerous as DeFeo. Kathy could no longer ignore the growing feeling that something deeply evil was rooted in the house. George's increasingly intense outbursts and the children's disturbing reports left her feeling powerless. She needed to find answers. After George's explosion of anger in the living room, Kathy decided to investigate the house alone, searching for any clues that could explain what was happening. That same night, after George descended to the basement once more, she quietly climbed the stairs, determined to explore a part of the house that had always given her chills: the basement. She had avoided that place since they moved in, but now she felt there was something hidden there, something that was feeding George's behavior. As she slowly descended the stairs, Kathy felt a shift in temperature as she approached the basement door. The air was heavier, charged with an oppressive energy. The wood of the stairs creaked under her feet, heightening her vulnerability. When she reached the last step, a cold breeze enveloped her, which seemed impossible in that enclosed space. She turned on the light, and the small ceiling lamp cast long, menacing shadows around the room. The basement was spacious but poorly utilized, filled with old boxes and dusty items left by previous owners. However, Kathy's gaze was immediately drawn to a wall at the back. There was something different about it, as if it didn't belong to the rest of the structure. With trembling hands, she approached. The wall was made of bricks, but what caught her attention was a small indentation in its surface. As she touched the spot, she noticed the bricks felt loose. Curious and frightened, she began to remove the bricks one by one. As she dismantled the makeshift wall, a small hidden room began to emerge. When the last brick fell, Kathy stepped back, shocked by what she found. The room was small and narrow, with walls painted blood red. The air inside was thicker, almost suffocating, and there was an undeniable sense of evil permeating the space. The concrete floor was dirty, as if it had never been cleaned, and in the center of the room were strange symbols drawn on the ground, which Kathy couldn't identify, but they clearly belonged to some kind of ritual. Fear washed over her. This place was the malignant heart of the house. Everything made sense now. The influence that had taken hold of George, the supernatural phenomena, the voices the children heard. Everything seemed to emanate from that small, sinister room. Kathy turned to leave, but tripped over an old box in the corner of the basement. She fell to the ground, and the contents of the box scattered around her. When she looked closer, she saw yellowed papers, and among them were photos of the former DeFeo family, the previous residents. There were also disturbing records, rituals described in detail, and symbols similar to those drawn on the floor of the Red Room. Her mind spiraled into horror. The house was not just the site of a crime. It had been the location of something much darker and older. Terrified, Kathy rushed back to the living room as quickly as she could, clutching some of the papers she had found. She needed to confront George. He had to know what was happening there. However, when she climbed the stairs, she found George standing in the doorway, his gaze glazed, with an expression that bordered on a trance. "You went down there?" he asked, his voice cold and hard, as if he already knew the answer. Kathy, her heart pounding, tried to stay calm. "Yes, George," I went, "and we need to get out of here. This house, this place, it's destroying us." But George didn't respond. He simply watched her, his eyes darkened by sleeplessness and the house's sinister influence. Kathy tried to show him the papers she had found. "Look at this, George. It explains everything. The DeFeo family, the rituals. This place is possessed by something old and evil. We can't stay here." But George didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he slowly approached, his footsteps heavy and almost threatening. "This house is mine. You don't understand. Here is where I feel at peace. Everything makes sense now. You're not going to take me away from here." George's tone terrified Kathy even more. The man she knew was disappearing before her eyes, consumed by something much greater and more malevolent than she could imagine. Desperate, she grabbed his arm, trying to bring her husband back. "Please, George, this house is destroying us. Don't you see what's happening to you? To the kids?" But George forcefully pulled his arm away. "They tell me what to do, Kathy. I know what needs to be done," he murmured, with a vacant look as he stepped back. There was something chillingly familiar about that phrase. She recognized it as nearly identical to words written in Ronald DeFeo's journal. That night, Kathy went to bed alone, trembling, holding her children close to her. George remained in the basement until dawn, murmuring to himself, lost in the darkness that enveloped him. The dawn brought a false sense of calm for Kathy, but the atmosphere in the house remained heavy and suffocating. Each family member felt the invisible weight of darkness that seemed to emanate from every corner, as if the house itself were alive, breathing malevolence. George, however, had changed. He no longer resembled the man Kathy knew and loved. His features were hardened, and his eyes, once filled with life, were now hollow, as if an external force had taken control of him. During breakfast, the tension was palpable. The children were restless, and George barely touched his food. Kathy's stomach churned as she realized that the strange behaviors were intensifying. Melissa cried incessantly, and Chris, fidgeting, insisted that his friend Jody was angry. "He said something bad is going to happen," Chris whispered to his mother, sending a chill down Kathy's spine. Later that day, while George was once again in the basement, Kathy decided to take action. She could no longer ignore what was happening. She knew the house was destroying her family, slowly consuming them, one by one. George's erratic behavior and the children's constant nightmares were clear signs that the malevolent presence was growing stronger. Kathy needed help, but she didn't know where to find it. Then, she remembered the priest who had called days earlier, warning her about the evil in the house. With trembling hands, she dialed his number. On the other end of the line, the priest's voice was serious and concerned. "I tried to warn you, Kathy. That house, it's corrupted by something I can't fully explain. You need to get out of there immediately," he said. "This entity is feeding on George's behavior, turning him into a channel for the evil that inhabits the house." Panic surged within Kathy. She knew the priest was right, but how could she convince George to leave when he seemed completely taken over? The man she knew had vanished, replaced by someone dark and dangerous. I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice choked with desperation. The priest hesitated before responding. "I will pray for you, but please don't wait any longer. There are forces there that no human should face alone. Kathy hung up the phone with a knot in her stomach. She knew time was running out. That night, the situation reached a breaking point. George was more agitated than ever, prowling the house like a predator, murmuring to himself. At 3:15 a.m., as on all previous nights, he got out of bed, but this time there was a dark determination in his eyes. Kathy watched him leave the room and decided to follow him silently, her heart pounding in her chest. George slowly descended the stairs, as if in a trance, heading straight for the basement. Kathy followed, keeping her distance, but when he entered the basement, something stopped her. It was an invisible presence, a weight in the air that seemed to squeeze her lungs. She heard George murmuring, and then suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, the sound of something heavy being dragged. Gathering her courage, Kathy descended into the basement. What she saw made her freeze. George stood in the center of the room, before the red room, that cursed space she had discovered. He held an axe in his hands. His eyes, fixed on the crimson walls, were wild, and his breath came in rapid gasps. "They want me to do it," he murmured repeatedly, like a macabre prayer. Kathy stepped forward, desperately trying to reach him. "George, please don't do this. This isn't you." But he didn't seem to hear her. His mind was completely dominated by the house, by the voices guiding him. Suddenly, he turned to her, raising the axe. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The look on George's face was pure hatred. But somewhere inside him, Kathy knew her true husband was still there, fighting to emerge. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Fight, George. Fight against this." George hesitated. The axe remained raised, but something in his posture shifted, as if a small spark of awareness had broken through the house's control. But before Kathy could take another step, a terrifying sound echoed through the basement. A deep, distorted laugh came from the shadows. The walls began to vibrate, and an invisible force pushed Kathy backward, slamming her against the stacked boxes. George, still in a trance, turned his gaze back to the red room, now engulfed in an even denser darkness. "I need to finish," he murmured, starting to advance toward the shadows. Desperate, Kathy struggled to get up, calling out to him. But George kept walking, his heavy steps echoing in the basement. Kathy knew that if he entered that room, it would be the end. The end of George, the end of their family. Summoning all her strength, she ran and grabbed George's arm. "No!" she screamed, pulling with all her might. For a brief moment, George stopped, as if struggling against the entity controlling him. Their eyes met, and she saw a glimmer of lucidity. "We need to get out of here," Kathy whispered, and in that instant, George seemed to awaken from his trance. He looked at the axe in his hands, horrified. He dropped the weapon to the ground, his eyes wide with terror. Without wasting a moment, Kathy pulled him out of the basement. The walls of the house trembled, as if the very structure were alive, resisting their escape. But she didn't stop. She climbed the stairs, calling for the children. "Come on, we need to leave now." Kathy ran through the house, calling for her children in desperation. The walls seemed to close in around her, as if the house itself were alive, trying to suffocate any attempt to escape. George, still dazed, followed closely behind, his hesitant footsteps echoing in the hallways. The lights flickered wildly, and inexplicable sounds, like whispers and distorted laughter, filled the air, making the atmosphere even more terrifying. Melissa and Chris were in their room, huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. Kathy burst in, grabbing both by the arms. "We need to get out of here now," she shouted, not wasting a moment. She knew that every second spent there was a struggle against an invisible force, something ancient and powerful that could not be defeated. As they rushed down the stairs, the floor seemed to tremble beneath their feet, as if the house were resisting, trying to keep them within its cursed confines. George stumbled, but Kathy pulled him back, refusing to leave him behind. He seemed weak, his mind still in shock from what he had almost done. Reaching the front door, Kathy yanked it open with all her strength, nearly tearing it off its hinges. The cold morning air flooded into the house, and for a brief moment, she felt relief. They were close to freedom. But the house would not let them go without a fight. A sharp, supernatural scream echoed from within, and the windows shattered, sending glass flying everywhere. George looked back, his face still pale and terrified, but Kathy pushed him outside. "Don't look back." She didn't know where her strength was coming from, but the instinct to protect her family drove her. With everyone outside, they ran across the yard, jumping over the fence to reach the car. Inside the vehicle, Kathy fumbled with the ignition, her hands shaking. It felt as if the car didn't want to start. Panic mounted with each failed attempt. George, still in shock, could barely help, and the children cried incessantly, desperate. Finally, the engine roared to life, and she sped away, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The Amityville house receded in the rearview mirror, but Kathy felt its presence still clinging to them, like a shadow. The silence in the car was suffocating, but the relief of being away from that place was undeniable. They drove aimlessly for hours, unsure of where to go, but certain they could never return. When they finally stopped at a roadside motel, it was morning. The rising sun offered a small comfort, though the terror of the previous night still lingered in their memories. Inside the motel room, Kathy looked at George. He sat on the bed, staring blankly, as if trying to comprehend what had happened. "I don't know what I would have done. I almost," he whispered, his words failing him. Kathy sat beside him, holding his hand, feeling the coldness of his skin. "It wasn't you, George. It was the house," she said softly, even as fear still simmered within her. The children fell asleep soon after, exhausted and emotionally drained. Kathy knew it would not be easy to forget what they had experienced. Even far from the house, the scars of that ordeal would remain forever. George, in particular, seemed burdened by a guilt that might never leave him. Days later, the family decided they would not return to Amityville, not even to collect their belongings. Everything they had left behind was tainted by evil, and bringing it back would be like reopening a wound that would never heal. The Lutzes began to rebuild their lives, but the fear they had lived in that house never completely left them. Months later, Kathy found herself looking out a window in their new apartment, reflecting on what they had faced. The Amityville house, now empty, still haunted her memories. Sometimes she could still hear the whispers, feel the same malevolent presence lingering in the distance. She wondered if they would ever truly be free. Then one night, while sorting through some old bills, Kathy found a photograph she didn't recognize among the papers, an image of the Amityville house taken from a strange angle. In the reflection of the eye-shaped windows, something or someone seemed to be looking out. She swallowed hard, a chill running down her spine. She quickly closed the photo, as if trying to erase what she had seen, but she knew it was impossible. The house was still there waiting, and the evil that resided within it would never completely vanish. It was merely dormant, waiting for its next opportunity to break.
If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Your support is really important to us and motivates us to bring more amazing stories. Thank you for watching.